Welcome everyone to ITSS Verona member series. And today we have the pleasure of hosting Joanna Chiu. She's a journalist based in Vancouver. She writes for the Toronto Star, where she covers China and Canada relations and another series of current affairs. She spent the past decade tracking China's rise, and she was based in Hong Kong and Beijing for 7 years, where she worked as a foreign correspondent. So thank you so much for being here, Joanna. And
thanks so much for having me.
She just recently published her book, which I highly recommend, China Unbound. And she's touching upon a wide range of hot topics, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, the Hong Kong protests, and China's surveillance. And she has a very interesting argument, which claims that China's rise is shaping a new world order that is actually a new world disorder, in her words, that has very disturbing implications for the global stability. So just because we are very curious about how you collected information for this book, and if you traveled to China and how you found the people you interviewed, we would like to ask you if you can share a few words on your methodologies and how you collected the data to write your book.
Yeah, well, thank you. So actually the subtitle New World Disorder refers not only to Beijing's action, but how the West has enabled China's expanding and rising authoritarianism, and, without, in a way, enabling some of the human rights issues we see happening right now, both in China and also, I argue, globally, where Chinese officials, police system have targeted foreign nationals, people around the world, and tried to stifle, put pressure against free speech, criticizing the Chinese government from all over the world. And, issues like hostage-taking diplomacy that we've seen in recent years, people like the two Michaels, the Canadians who were taken as, political pawns and political prisoners in the Mengwanzhou Huawei case. So, my argument is that these things, human rights in China and what the government is doing, definitely is contributing to the state of, disorder and anxiety. But really, I think a lot of Western governments have to look at what they've done or what they haven't done, and why there is such a lack of really well-informed, nuanced, effective foreign policies in different countries around the world relating to China. Instead, like, we've actually been quite, taken by surprise, it seems, or a lot of publics around the world have been shocked by some recent events when, China experts and people of the Chinese international community, diaspora, have been trying to improve conversations around China for decades. As far as methodology, I worked actually in China as a foreign correspondent for 7 years, first in Hong Kong and then in Beijing. So the first part of my book really kind of touches on the knowledge I was able to gain from being there on the ground, going to cover diplomatic summits, interaction between China and world leaders, and then Chinese, the whole kind of security states and how it affected Chinese people, like lawyers, feminists, activists, professors, experiences that I was able to get firsthand. But the rest of the book, actually, the methodology, most of these case studies in Western countries were from reporting trips that I took after I left China in late 2018. So case studies include Turkey, the US, Canada, not France, Turkey, Italy, and Greece, US, Canada, and Australia, and also Russia. So why I wanted to make it so global was because I was looking at almost like cross-country case studies and comparisons to, honestly, I was trying to look for one place where that's maybe got the China policies right or the best. So you can take like the best examples from different countries. But unfortunately, what I found was in each country, people were quite frustrated at how things are going. So definitely there's more I think, downsides and things that were coming quite late than I expected. And this was including in Italy, but I went to Italy in late 2019 and things are quite different now.
Yeah, so talking about Italy, where Verona is based and connecting to what you just said, our first question regards the memorandum of understanding that was signed in 2019 between China and Italy. And that was a controversial memorandum of understanding. I would say it was highly criticized all over the world. And when they signed in Rome, many media outlets were very quick in claiming that Italy was going to fall into the debt trap, like many other countries. And many people will say that Rome was about to cede its national assets to Beijing. But I also read the work of other scholars, and what they claim is that these fears are exaggerated because the memorandum of understanding was just an expression of intention, and was not really going to give access to China to the entire ports, but only to a few parts of it. In the case of Trieste, it will be a railway station, and in the case of Genoa, it will be, for example, just a dam. So many scholars believe that these fears were overblown, and there is also this system that we have in Italy, the Golden Power, that is that is basically established to protect Italy from this to happen. So, what is your take on this perspective? Do you agree with the media or with the scholars?
Yeah, so the Belt and Road Project is quite interesting because, beforehand, Chinese leaders have already encouraged its state-owned companies to make investments overseas to help promote, business opportunities, trade opportunities for China all over the world. And, talked about it in a way that it was also good for China's soft power, political power, and political influence around the world. But really, the Belt and Road Project was President Xi Jinping's, one of his trademark economic projects. And it really put almost like an umbrella label over existing infrastructure projects and deals around the world, plus going to the future. And it also was included in the Chinese constitution. So that really signaled that the Belt and Road Project is politically significant, and Chinese leaders really wanted to succeed and for it to be respected and and they always, according to Chinese state media, more than 200 countries have signed on for things like MOUs, if not more concrete or detailed deals. But Italy's case was interesting because the country was the first major European nation and the first G7 member to join to have this, MOU. Before that, the UK was an early supporter, but despite all of the separate trade deals, infrastructure deals between the British and the Chinese, the UK stopped short of signing a deal, to paper. So when Italy did this, I think it surprised many of its traditional allies in Europe as well as the US because of this kind of suspicion that the project did have political ramifications or motivations, that Italy should have at least consulted with its traditional allies before going on and making the symbolic decision to sign on to the project. But what was really interesting, because I went there to Rome and Palermo, I arrived a few months after Xi Jinping did his state visit, where there was that joint declaration of this deal. I retraced the steps, and it's at the time and hyping up these deals. The previous five-star government had made all of these economic promises, before they were elected, and Italian experts on China told me that they really were trumpeting up China as a way that they could fulfill all of their promises to turn around the Italian economy. There are all these factories that are struggling, all these ports you said that were struggling, and China was really kind of portrayed in some articles and some speeches by some Italian politicians as going to come in to fix everything. But as you said, they weren't, because of existing laws and regulations, they weren't actually going to come in and just take over everything. But, what's interesting was that the idea that they would basically come and pour in a lot of money, run the show, wasn't taken as a negative thing in Italy for the most part. It was taken as positive. I spoke with the mayor of Palermo, and he kind of laughed about it. He said, there's so much fanfare around President Xi's visit, but really there was no way, at least in Sicily, that China would be allowed to play a big role in the ports because of existing the existing presence of the U.S. military and commitments to the U.S. as a more, traditional ally. A lot of it, he said, was hot air. So it was really interesting because in Italy, especially, there was so much talk about China. People like Michele Geraci, former economic minister, he really it seemed to kind of feed little nuggets like, oh, China might invest in this or that, things that did not come to fruition. So what would you say? I haven't been there since my last visit in late 2019. So Carlotta, how would you say that things have shifted now with the new prime minister, the new government in charge?
Yeah, my idea is that when the memorandum of understanding was signed, China didn't really consider that when you sign a deal with Italy, you need to deal with a schizophrenic kind of political system, because our governments just keep changing all the time. I think on average they do change every year and a half, if I'm saying it correctly. So schizophrenic system. And back in the days when they signed the memorandum, we had a coalition between the Five Star Movement and League, the far right League. So their vision was very anti-European, and it was a populist coalition. So they wouldn't play by the rules. But now we have Mario Draghi, so I think things changed, and Mario Draghi, also because of his background, just will push Italy back to its traditional alliances. So this is why also in my view, I do believe that those fears were overblown, because in Italy the situation just changes so quickly that it was maybe too early to say something like that.
Yeah. And, the economist I mentioned a book called Italy, a Flawed Democracy, because of, the government changing so quickly, a high degree of fragmentation with short-lived coalition governments. I'm just wondering, do you think the current Draghi government might last longer, or this might be the direction Italy will stay in?
Well, I hope so. And I think he might be the right person to sort of change how things are, because because of his background and his knowledge. So I think this might be a positive change for Italy.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the controversy around the MOU wasn't that it happened, was because Italy did it kind of independently of European allies.
Italian style.
It was more symbolic rather than concrete. Whereas in my reporting Greece, in the same trip, what's happening in Greece and China is more concrete. Like Chinese state-owned company Costco did take over for a 30-year lease Port of Piraeus, and did put in a lot of money and also invested a major stake in the Greece, the state grid, the electricity operator. And Greece doesn't have those kind of regulations that limit foreign investment that way. It was very open to it, with all the backdrop of the debt crisis and being indebted to the EU, really open to Chinese investment. And there, I think Chinese impact was more concrete. And again, it's interesting because even talking to dock workers, the union, they were quite, they had come around to Chinese investment. They're saying that actually, wages have stayed stable, working conditions are pretty good. They're quite open to it. So do you think the mood in Italy is still quite open to more Chinese investment? Or, looking at the surveys, like the Pew surveys of attitudes in different countries, it seems that things are slowly getting to be more negative after the COVID-19 outbreak towards China.
It's tricky to say, because I also read an article. Actually, it was written by a student at King's College, and she reported some interviews with Italian citizens as well, where they actually had conflicting views, because some of them were actually really positive towards China, because they did remember the help we received in Italy after the deaths we registered in Bergamo, when the European Union was not really stepping in to help. And at the time, China would send medical equipments and masks and everything we needed. So in her work, she registered these this series of contrasting views, because you will have some Italians saying, no, we want to stick to our traditional allies, and we want to stick to NATO and the United States. We are not going towards China. But then you will have a good numbers of Italians actually saying that they didn't believe in the European Union anymore, and they actually wanted to open up to China. And I remember that when the medical equipment came to Italy, on some of the equipment, the Chinese would write, "You will only see friends in the time of need," something like this.
Yeah,
so I think that's really
interesting.
The Italian psyche somehow.
Yeah, that is interesting, because in I think a lot of parts of the world, COVID-19, along with the headlines about the two Michaels and Huawei, led to spike in anti-Asian racism and hate crimes, and people scapegoating people of Chinese or Asian descent for the coronavirus outbreak. So yeah, it's interesting that in Italy there was some goodwill there. But talking to entrepreneurs, people who wanted to expand their businesses in China from Italy and Greece, what struck me was that they were very pragmatic about it. They said, it's important, it's like this good opportunities, and they admitted that they felt that they didn't really have a role to really care about human rights. They hadn't really heard at that time about what was happening in Xinjiang or Hong Kong. So, still looking at China basically as how can we benefit as Italians, rather than, what's a moral context, and, labor conditions, for example, or whether it's ethical to, sign these deals rather than put pressure on Beijing to stop its human rights abuses. So, that region, I think it really sums up why I wanted to write this book, to provide by, doing this on the ground interviews with different stakeholders of very different opinions, some completely opposite opinions represented in the book. That context behind these questions about how to balance relations with China.
Okay, I will move on to the next question, if I may. So you also talk about Hong Kong in your book, and I remember I was there during the process, and one of the things you will hear in Hong Kong back in the days was today is Hong Kong and tomorrow will be Taiwan. So do you think Taiwan will be coming next? What's your perspective on this? Do you agree with the Hong Kong protesters?
So the idea is that a lot of Hong Kongers, I didn't think that things would happen so quickly. That it was always when I was living there and attending all of these pro-democracy protests that people were warning, like, we need to stand up for our rights, because if we're not careful, Hong Kong will be just another Chinese city very soon, with the same lack of rule of law, press freedom, and institutions. And it was seen as like, in the future, this will happen. But with the national security law in Hong Kong, it has happened, where, in some ways, people in Hong Kong are telling me now that it's even worse than mainland China, because at least in the mainland, people have been dealing with these situations for a long time, whereas in Hong Kong, things change so quickly. Like, a lot of people are living in fear and anxiety because they don't know where the red lines are, what the rules are, what might land them or their employees or their friends or family in jail, because it's also new. So I think people in Taiwan are looking at this because for a long time, I think the one country, two systems arrangement was a message to Taiwan, like, look, joining back with motherland is not going to be so bad. You'll be one country, but you can retain your way of life, your freedoms relative to the mainland. One country, two systems. So Taiwan seeing one country, two systems really just fail in Hong Kong, and the Chinese government really just, not just backing away from its commitments, but just completely just going way beyond what people would expect in backing out against these agreements. I think it does send a message to people in Taiwan that, reunification with the mainland, it's not going to be that rosy idea of harmony and not their way of life not changing. I think the question is whether there might be conflict with Taiwan in the future, whether Beijing would use, military force to take over. But really, speaking with, colleagues in Taiwan, they often say that the risk right now of war is overblown. It's just really interesting because the Biden administration in the US seems to be signaling more and more that they would do more to defend Taiwan if any kind of conflict were to take place. So where they think there's no imminent danger of conflict, different sides are kind of changing their signaling on what they would do if such a situation were to take place. And the US is signaling that it would play a more active role in coming to the defense of Taiwan.
Thank you very much.
So I know we're running short on time, so I'll ask, we brought up Xinjiang, so I just thought I'd ask you a question. In your book, you discuss China's human rights violations on the Uyghur minority group in Xinjiang province. Since 2014, under President Xi, China has imprisoned more than 1 million Uyghurs in internment camps, committed acts such as torture, forced labor, political indoctrination, suppression of religious rights, forced sterilization, forced contraception, and forced abortion. There's a statistic from the Chinese government that shows from 2015 to 18 that the birth rate went down, I think, 60%. The United States, Canada's parliament, Dutch parliament, UK parliament, and Lithuania have declared the acts of the Chinese government as genocide. And other countries such as New Zealand, Belgium, and the Czech Republic have condemned the actions as crimes against humanity. So I guess, to what end do you believe that President Xi is attacking the Uyghurs and other minority groups in China to such unprecedented levels?
Yeah, so I do try to answer those questions in the book. It's kind of too complicated to try to go through in a few minutes. It took me, so long just to try to write the history of Xinjiang in a few pages in the book, and it just, it's so hard to sum up. But I do link to other, scholarly works in the book if people want to explore it further. Really, it's very complicated because President Xi, Chinese leadership views what they're doing in Xinjiang as necessary to prevent terrorism, basically. It's almost, people told me it's almost a form of preemptive crackdowns and kind of criminalization of really innocuous religious and cultural behaviors, like wearing a long beard, doing different acts that a Muslim person would want to do all over the world, kind of putting different behaviors related to being a Muslim minority into these group of actions that are seen as kind of pre-criminal, that makes you potentially a terrorist, basically, or a separatist, as is often said in China. And that, is using all of this language to justify the so-called re-education that the Chinese think is necessary in Xinjiang. The book goes into the history of the riots and clashes, where there have been some isolated terrorist incidents that, such as a knife attack in the Kashgar train station. So all of this context has led to basically the leadership just kind of criminalizing being Muslim, a minority in Xinjiang. And that has led to these, the terrible conditions that you described in these camps, many of which still exist. The Chinese government says a lot inmates have graduated to labor, but now there are concerns over forced labor or really repressive and problematic work conditions in some of these, vocational jobs that Uyghurs have been taking. So I think really I would recommend that people read the book and read work of scholars and journalists who have worked in this area, because it's just so complex. It really was the most challenging chapter for me to write. And it's more challenging because reporting in Xinjiang itself is almost impossible. I did my interviews in Istanbul with Uyghurs living in exile, including a woman who spent 15 months in one of these internment camps.
Right.
And yeah, so I think some